Exercises 8.1, you were asked to put this argument into symbolic form and then to determine whether or not the argument was valid or invalid. Now, I thought most of these were pretty straightforward. There were a couple that were actually really tricky. So if you don't get all of these, that's okay. Really, what I want you to be getting from this exercise and the previous one is just the habit of identifying the symbolic form, being able to identify the component propositions, identify the connectives. So here the first example was either I'm hearing things or someone is out in the hall singing Jingle Bells. Man, this is some weird stuff. I know I'm not hearing things, so there's someone out in the hall singing. So the component propositions, or the symbolic form, I should say, is simply P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Notice here that P, what that stands for is I'm hearing things, and Q stands for someone is out in the hall. Then this sentence right here, I know I'm not hearing things, since P stood for I'm hearing things, and this is saying I'm not hearing things, we're going to say not P, and then down here, there's someone out in the hall singing. That's just an abbreviated someone out in the hall singing Jingle Bells. So this is the symbolic form of this argument, and this is a valid argument. So anytime you deny one of the disjuncts, and then after denying one of the disjuncts, you affirm the other. So you can deny one disjunct and then affirm the other. That's perfectly okay. What you can't ever do is affirm one of them and then use that as a means of reasoning to deny one of them. Okay. Either the circuit is broken or the light bulb is dead, but I know the light bulb isn't dead, so the circuit must be broken. Well, this is very similar to the last one, only in the first one, it was P or Q, not P. In this one, it's P or Q, not Q. It's P or Q, not Q, therefore P, and this also is a valid argument. Notice here again, the component proposition in the first sentence, the circuit is broken, that is P. Like I said before, if this isn't clear, we're just using P or Q. We could have used any letter we wanted. We don't even have to use letters. I could have used numbers. I could have, instead of using the P, I could have said, well, I'm going to let a triangle represent the circuit is broken, and I'm going to let a circle represent the light bulb is dead. Those don't matter. They're just placeholders for these propositions. So P or Q, and notice here that Q represents the light bulb is dead, and then but I know the light bulb isn't dead, so if Q represents the light bulb is dead, then not Q is going to represent this sentence, and then so the circuit must be broken, which is P. This is valid. Number 3, I have to get the book here in town or else go into New York City next weekend, but I can't get it here, therefore I will have to get it in New York. And this is P or Q, not P, therefore Q, and this is also valid. We're noticing a trend here, a lot of valid arguments. There are only 2 possible responses to this threat. We send in the troops or we negotiate. Negotiation is out of the question, so we must send in the troops. Here again, P or Q, not Q, therefore P. This is also a valid argument. Number 5. I can't both go to the movie. I can't both go. Typo here. I can't both go to the movies with you tonight and study for the exam, and I have to study for the exam, so I can't go. This one I thought was actually one of the more difficult ones for your homework assignment. And I want to point out something here is notice that in the first premise, I can't both go to the movies with you and study, we have the word and appear here. We don't have, which is our usual case, we don't have the word or. So this is actually, even though this is in the section on disjunction, we have a different kind of proposition. And the truth is, if we're doing this, here's how we are going to represent this. It's going to be, the symbolic form is going to be not P and Q. That's what the first sentence is saying. If you look at it, it is not the case that I can go to the movies and I can study for the exam. It's saying not P and Q, and then it goes on to say Q, because Q represents I will study for the exam, and then therefore not P. Now, that's how it's said, and this is why I said this is complicated, because Um, as we're going to learn later on, you can say things using different connectives. Like you can use some connectives and you can combine them in one way, and then you can use different ones and combine them in a different way and say the exact same thing. And you could have said something different here, and this is going to be completely equivalent. You could have written the following: not P or not Q, Q therefore not P. And what's important to notice here is that this sentence, not P and Q, this is equivalent, that's my equal sign right there, this is equivalent to this sentence right here, this proposition. Those are the same exact, they're logically equivalent. That means if the one on the left-hand side is true, that the one on the right-hand side must also be true, and vice versa. That's what logical equivalence comes to. This is why this is in the section on disjunction, and some of you may even have just thought what you see right here on the right-hand side. This might have been what occurred to you from the beginning, not P or not Q. Now notice, I want to just point this out while we're on the subject. By the way, if you didn't get this one, don't stress because we're going to talk about this at greater length. But I want to point out something here is that the word not, the way it functions over here on the left-hand side, that's actually denying this entire disjunction. I'm sorry, not disjunction, but conjunction. It's denying the truth of P and Q, saying P and Q is false. Whereas over here on the right-hand side, this is saying P is false or Q is false. Right? It's different from saying P and Q, that whole statement is false, versus saying this disjunction this disjunct is false, P is false, or Q is false. So the way the word not is functioning here, what I just said might have been a little confusing, sorry. These statements are logically equivalent, but the reason they're logically equivalent has to do in part with the way the word not is functioning. And what I just said might have confused some of you, but over here the word not is actually ranging over this entire statement, right? Whereas over here, not only ranges over just P, and on this side it ranges over just Q. And for that reason, in addition with what the words or and mean in logic, these statements come out to be logically equivalent, even though they're being said differently. Anyways, if you got one of these two, you're in good shape. If you didn't get one of these two, it's not a big deal at the moment. This was actually, I don't even know why they put this one in this section. This was kind of a tricky one. Anyway, end of the day, this is a valid argument. Because what you're doing down here, so let's say you got the one on the left-hand side. Let's say this is the one that you did. Notice that you are denying the disjunct. Because right here, the disjunct is not Q, and you're saying Q. So what is Q? I mean, Q is basically is saying that not Q is false. In other words, 2 right here is equivalent to saying not Q. So you're saying this disjunct right here is false. I know this is a little tricky because some of this is involving some stuff that the book hasn't covered and we haven't talked about yet. But remember, anytime you have a disjunctive syllogism, if you deny one of the two disjuncts, then you are okay, then you'll have a valid argument. And so if you say, here's my disjunction, not P or not Q, and then I'm saying not Q, then it's perfectly okay to infer not P. It gets a little bit confusing, I know, with all the nots here. It reminds me of the episode of The Simpsons when Bart was shown like a flyer and it said, "Don't do what Johnny Don't does." You know, it's like, what? It's a little confusing, but if you didn't get it, honestly, this is, I feel like, one of the more difficult ones from the homework assignment. So if you didn't get this one, don't stress. If you did, that's an extra star on your crown in heaven, so good for you. All right, we need Brody or Emily to play for the red team. Brody can't play. Man, typo machine tonight. So Emily will. So we have again P or Q, where P represents Brody will play, Q represents Emily will play for the red. Let me back up. P represents Brody will play for the red team, or Q represents Emily will play for the red team. Not Brody will play, therefore Emily will play, and this argument is valid. I think this next one is the one that's politically incorrect, yeah. So you can tell this book was written a few years ago because, I don't know, this might sound a little politically incorrect to some people nowadays, but either marriage is sacrosanct or gays can get married. So it's either sacrosanct or gays can get married. Gays can get married, so marriage isn't sacrosanct. And so we have P or Q, Q, not P, and this is an invalid argument. And this is guilty of the fallacy of affirming. Remember, it's affirming because you're saying this is true right here. You're saying this disjunct is true. And since you're affirming that disjunct, that is a fallacy. And the reason being goes back to what we talked about in the previous lecture about how the word or is ambiguous in natural language. There's an exclusive sense and an inclusive sense. And since you can't always trust affirming one of the disjuncts, you can't always trust that that argument form is not valid. You can always trust denying one of the disjuncts, but you can't trust affirming. Okay. Jackson must be a liberal because he certainly isn't a conservative. Now, this was an interesting one because you had an implied premise. And the way I took the implied premise to be is Jackson is either a liberal or he's a conservative. So P represents Jackson is a liberal. Q represents Jackson is a conservative. Not Q, he's not a conservative. Therefore, he's a liberal. And this is a valid argument. Number 9. According to the union contract, either we will have to close the plant on Labor Day or we have to pay the workers twice the regular wage. But we have too much work to close the plant, so we have to pay the workers double time. So this one is the same as we've seen thus far, where right here, P represents we have to close the plant on Labor Day. Q represents we have to pay the workers twice as much. Now, it never says outright not Q, but I think that is clearly implied by this sentence right here. We have too much to close the plant. So basically it's saying we can't close the plant, or in other words, not P, therefore Q. And so this argument is also valid. Number 10. Either Paul will win his case or he won't be promoted to partner. He wasn't promoted to partner, so he must have lost the case. And the way we symbolize this argument is as follows. P or not Q, therefore not P. And this argument is invalid. Now, this one's a little tricky, and I want to talk about it for a second, but let's look up here at the component propositions. We have one right here, Paul will win his case, or he won't be promoted, notice the won't, to partner. And if we were to let P represent Paul will win his case, and we look down here and we have it written in the first part of our disjunction, and then we notice the conclusion right here, so he must have lost. Well, that's the opposite of P, so we know the conclusion is going to be not P, so we could already mark that in if we wanted. But then we look right here at the second part of the disjunction. We have P represent Paul will win his case. He won't be promoted to partner. Now, notice that negative. I pointed that out a second ago. We're saying not Q. We're saying he won't be promoted to partner. So Q is going to represent he will be promoted to partner. So the first proposition here in our disjunctive syllogism is P or not Q. And then we say he wasn't promoted, so not Q, therefore not P. And you might be thinking, wait, I thought you said you could deny one of the disjuncts and then have a valid argument. Well, here you have to think about what the disjuncts are. And the disjunct here is P, that's the first disjunct, and the second one is not Q. And if you write not Q here again, you're actually not denying that disjunct. You're saying this disjunct is true. You're saying not Q is true. To deny the disjunct here would have been to say Q. That would have been to deny that disjunct. But you're not saying that. You're actually saying not Q is true. You're saying it's not. You're saying it's like this. Paul won his case or he wasn't promoted. I'm just reading this back to you, but he wasn't promoted. I mean, you're saying it is true that he wasn't promoted. You're saying this disjunct is true. So you're not actually denying it. Like I said, to deny it would be to say not, let me write this out here, this is kind of tough, not, man, this is hard to write with your mouse, not Q. That is denying it, because not Q is the actual disjunct. If you said not Q, which of course is just to say Q, that would be a denial of the disjunct. But you're not. You're affirming the disjunct. And like I've said many times, to affirm the disjunct is a fallacious form of reasoning. And so therefore this argument is invalid. Now I know some of these problems were a little trickier than others, and if you didn't get them all, don't stress too much, because we're actually going to be studying this in greater detail as we move forward. Right now I just want you to be able to do a couple of things: identify component propositions, identify the connectives, and then to start to develop a sense of how to put arguments into symbolic forms and propositions into symbolic form and the way that you've been shown. It's also really good if you can already start to develop a sense of arguments that are valid or invalid. We're going to study this, like I said, in greater detail, so if you didn't quite get it, it's okay. We're going to practice that skill at greater length. Like always, though, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.